Producer David Frost was attending a screening of E.T. when the theater played a trailer for his own upcoming extraterrestrial movie, The Thing. But when it played to absolute silence, he turned to the other producers and said, "We're dead." And unfortunately, he wasn't wrong. The Thing would release to absolutely terrible critical reception and a mediocre box office. But it's now revered as one of the greatest horror movies of all time. We're talking all about it this week in Kaden's Movie Club. Reviews for The Thing were borderline hostile. Here's just a few ways critics described the movie: boring, nihilistic, unoriginal, stereotypical, gruesome, repulsive, futile, a moron movie. First off, the movie wasn't gaining any favor by being a remake. The original was 1951's The Thing from Another World, and that movie had been adapted from a 1938 novella called Who Goes There? The plot also shared themes and ideas from other famous movies like Fantastic Voyage and Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which had also been remade. All of these movies deal heavily with the fear of paranoia. What happens when people in tight-knit small communities can't trust each other?
It isn't Benny!
All of their plots revolve around a situation in which the characters know that somebody could be an imposter but aren't sure who. These stories were popular in different eras of the Cold War tied to Red Scares, when people feared their neighbors might actually be secret communists or even Soviet spies.
But there are other communists who don't show their real faces, who work more silently.
And the rhetoric from the government often fueled these sorts of fears, which made this theme of social paranoia relevant time and again over the years. When 1982's version of The Thing came along, the US was still very much experiencing Cold War tensions. But apparently this wasn't what audiences wanted to deal with in their entertainment. A couple weeks ago, we took a look at Blade Runner, which came out the same year, and there's some interesting crossover. While very different in tone and theme, both movies are sci-fi stories that raise difficult ideas about contemporary society. The movie is posing uncomfortable questions to the audience and providing ambiguous answers. Frankly, I don't know if general audiences ever really liked that sort of thing, but they certainly didn't in 1982. At a test screening for The Thing, John Carpenter was answering audience questions. When somebody asked him what really happened at the end of The Thing, he said, "It's up to your imagination." The person responded, "I hate that." I think we've become a bit more receptive to ambiguity in our stories today, and I wonder if this is one of the few instances where internet discourse may have actually been helpful. We've seen it this year with movies like Weapons and Sinners, for instance. People were immediately able to find communities that wanted to engage in analytical thinking about these movies. Back in 1982, you wouldn't have had that resource. Whether that was a contributing factor or not, audiences weren't too thrilled with the story The Thing was telling. It starts with Norwegian scientists hunting down a dog. Aw, sad. Well, it would be if this thing was really a dog. But the Americans at the scientific outpost aren't aware of the dog's true nature when they let it into their research station. Little do they know, this thing has just wiped out the entire Norwegian research team. We come to find out that the dog is merely an imitation of a dog, because the thing is actually an alien that has the ability to assimilate any living creature and function as a perfect copy. And the horror here is twofold. The paranoia we discussed earlier of not knowing who your enemy is plays a big role here. It culminates in a scene where the group's leader ties everyone up and individually tests samples of their blood for some kind of reaction. As you can imagine, anyone that's resisting seems suspicious. But are they an imposter, or are they just terrified because they're strapped to a chair and don't feel like they can trust their colleagues to do the right thing?
You and Palmer, tie everybody down real tight.
What for?
For your health.
Come on, let's rush him. He's not gonna blow us all up.
And the other source of the horror is, of course, the thing itself. Turns out, watching an alien creature morph into different organisms is absolutely disgusting. Universal allotted their highest effects budget ever at around $200,000. This was soon increased to $750,000, but by the end of production ended up around $1.5 million. And this was even after they cut some even more complicated scenes. This movie was ambitious. Unfortunately, it was all too real for audiences of 1982. One of the biggest complaints against the movie was that it was just too repulsive, too gory. Everyone recognized the technical craft going on in these effects, but would have preferred not to see them. And by today's standards, I think these effects still look pretty great. But as effects and technology have continued improving over time, I wonder if this doesn't quite hold the same impact it did at the time. The other big complaint was that the movie's story was too bleak. It was criticized for having no heroes, no optimism, no faith in humanity. These men distrust each other and their situation is dire with no real solution. Because of this, the studio actually shot 3 different endings. The ending we see in the movie is that MacReady and Childs are the last 2 left, and neither of them knows for sure if the other is the thing. For a studio-approved happy ending, as a result from test audiences, MacReady escapes and tests his blood, showing he is not infected. Carpenter thought that was cheesy, so he and the studio compromised and had one where MacReady was just alone. It implied he defeated the thing, so even though he didn't make it out, it was slightly better. This was going to be the ending, but shortly before release, Carpenter decided he'd rather give the audience something to chew on and switched it back to the original ending. And executives weren't too happy about it. They wanted a definitive defeat of the monster. They wanted something to cheer for. Which is kind of funny because I think executives today would prefer the story be open-ended to allow for sequels and maybe a whole franchise.
Big mistake acknowledging the stall.
But Carpenter later admitted he thought it may not have been heroic enough for audiences at the time. I mentioned before that the US was still experiencing Cold War tensions, but they were also in a recession. Based on the fact that movies like E.T., Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Rocky III did well that year, while Blade Runner and The Thing ranked much lower at the box office, I think it's safe to say audiences generally wanted their entertainment to be a little more optimistic. I don't personally read The Thing as a nihilistic story the way critics believed it was at the time. While it's certainly not upbeat, the characters make decisions at multiple points in the movie to sacrifice themselves to ensure that this creature does not escape Antarctica. They know it would destroy humanity and make the deliberate decision to contain it at the expense of their own lives.
What can we do? Whether we make it or not, we can't let the thing freeze again.
It's interesting to me that the pure lack of a better outcome made critics in 1982 believe it was nihilistic, while my reading of it is just that I'm glad these guys had some greater good in mind, and that's more than enough. I wonder if it's just another example of how movies sometimes need time to find their audiences. Over the course of the last 2 months of Movie Club, we've looked at a lineup of blockbusters and sleeper hits. The blockbusters were usually lightning-in-a-bottle moments that tapped directly into what audiences at the time wanted to see. But our sleeper hits seemed to come at the exact wrong time. The Shawshank Redemption was overshadowed by Forrest Gump and other popular movies. Its name was hard to remember and people thought it looked depressing. But it was a movie that employed all the different elements of great filmmaking to tell a truly hopeful story. Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory was marketed as a family-friendly musical. But in truth, it was more of a satire of that kind of movie filled with sarcastic, ironic humor which was more appealing for later generations. Blade Runner was a new take on noir films that created a brand new aesthetic and influenced entirely new subgenres. It was overlooked due to its dark and gritty world but would inspire a rising class of filmmakers. The Big Lebowski was pitched to audiences as a follow-up to a different movie, so people went in with expectations that weren't met. It took time and multiple watches for most people to appreciate that this story wasn't the crime mystery it was being sold as. And The Thing was absolutely shredded by critics for being gory and bleak. There was a collective clutching of pearls, only for later audiences to rank this amongst the very best in the genre. So what saved these movies from falling into obscurity? We can't possibly overstate the significance of home media. All of these films received a cultural resurgence thanks to TV broadcasts, VHS, and DVD, often decades after their release. It allowed them to find fresh audiences that brought a new generation's perspective to the story. And it reinforces the idea that great works of art are often overlooked or misunderstood in their time. We can also thank the niche groups of fans that recognized these movies for what they were, people who kept these films in the cultural conversation even when they'd been dismissed. Because of passionate people sharing what they loved, these movies were given a second life. In the age of the internet, our discourse has never been so constant and confident. People will regularly make statements about subjective material, like movies, as if it's authoritative. And this is nothing new, but it's more pervasive than ever. Film criticism and analysis is important, but never let anybody instill doubt in your mind if something resonated with you. Whether it's a famous movie critic or some film bro yelling into a podcast mic, let them have their opinion, but keep your own, because you might just be ahead of your time. And before we wrap up, I want to give a massive shout out to a key part of Movie Club, my wife Shannon. Kaden's Movie Club was actually her idea. She reads every single script, helps choose themes and movies, and stands behind the camera scrolling up on an iPad so I can read off of it. She's standing there right now.
I really am.
She's an integral part of making any of this happen. She's the reason I'm doing it at all, and it's her 30th birthday this week, so happy birthday, Shan. I love you. But for now, that concludes our August Movie Club. I'll be announcing the movie lineup and theme for September tomorrow, so stay tuned. And if you want to receive direct updates on Movie Club, you know where to go.